if someone was to ask me what my favorite book in the Bible is, I would struggle with that because I don't just have one favorite book. I have two of them, in fact, and those two books are the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation. And in my opinion, those two books can't be separated, because especially when you read the book of Revelation, remembering that the Bible interprets itself. There are many verses from the book of Revelation which are taken from other books. The Bible explains itself. So, and what really helps us to understand the book of Revelation is the book of Daniel. So I wanted to make some videos where I'll be going chapter by chapter in the book of Daniel, decoding the book of the book of Daniel chapter by chapter, and just to explain why the books of Daniel and Revelation are my favorite books is because they contain a lot of prophecies, and one of the reasons why I'm still a Christian despite all the stuff that all the negative things that I've mentioned in my videos, is because to me prophecy, proves not only proves God's existence, but proves that God is right and that the Bible is his word. So I'm calling this series of videos Decoding Daniel, and this is going to be chapter 1. So I'm not going to be reading, for instance, I'm not going to be reading everything in chapter 1 or reading everything in chapter 2. I'm just going to be doing a summary, but where I feel certain things need to be explained, especially when it comes to where symbolic language is used, I might maybe go a bit in depth. So I just wanted to start with Daniel chapter 1, like I said, and in Daniel chapter 1, I wanted to mention who the main characters are in chapter 1. So in the very first verse, we read of Jehoiakim, who was the king of Judah. So the setting is the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim. As an interesting thing to note is that the J there in Jehoiakim's name, that wasn't there. And it's just like Jesus is not really Jesus is not really Jesus' name. His name is actually Yeshua, and in English that would be Joshua. Okay, so there was no J in the Hebrew language, from my understanding. So this king's name would have been Jehoiakim, who was a king of Judah. It says he was taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar. Is another character that we read about. And for those who some of you might have noticed that there are two different ways to write Nebuchadnezzar's name. I think it's in the book of Jeremiah, which I'm actually reading through right now, is sometimes referred to as Nebuchadrezzar. But I actually questioned that. I questioned why he's sometimes referred to as Nebuchadnezzar and sometimes Nebuchadrezzar. It's one of those names was actually an insult to him. That's why you find that there's different ways of writing his name. So Nebuchadnezzar came and besieged Jerusalem in the third year of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. And the reason why God allowed this is because the Israelites, we just call them Israelites, but at this point, the nation of Israel had been destroyed. The other tribes, the majority of the tribes had been destroyed. Only Judah was left. But now Judah was being besieged by the Babylonians because they were in disobedience, following or worshipping other gods. And it says, verse 2 starts by saying, "And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, into Nebuchadnezzar's hands, and there were yeah, they carried the Babylonians carried the vessels from the house of God into Babylon. But so Jehoiakim was not the only one who was taken into Babylon. There were other captives as well. So this was like today we would call it colonization. Judah was colonized by the Babylonians, and the um, the the princes from the tribe of Judah were also taken as well as many from the tribe of Judah were. It says the children of Israel and of the king's seed. This is verse 3, and of the princes that were taken to Babylon. Basically, Daniel chapter 1 is talking about how Judah was conquered by Babylon, and those who were taken captive to Babylon, some from the many that were taken to Babylon, some of them were chosen by Nebuchadnezzar to be trained so that they could be they could work for the king of Babylon. And one of the things they did is that they were taught the tongue or the language of the Chaldeans, which is another word for the Babylonians. And it says that in verse 5, and the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. So these children children of Israel, of the king's seed and of the princes, they were trained for 3 years. And at the end of 3 years, the training was supposed to come to an end, that they might stand before the king. When he says stand before the king, they might work for the king. Now, there were, out of these kids that were taken captive, there were 3 who are mentioned in verse 6. It says they were of the children of Judah. There was Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names. So the prince of the eunuchs is actually mentioned in verse 3. His name was Ashpenaz. Remember that I said I want to mention the main characters here. So it was Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, and then later on we go on to learn of another character called Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs, Ashpenaz, had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So these 4 boys, it says actually verse 8, Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. So when he says he would not defile himself, there are some Christians who say that Daniel refused to eat meat because eating meat is bad. That's not the case. He refused to eat meat that would defile him. So in other words, Daniel refused to eat the meat that God said should not be eaten in Leviticus 11. I'm not going to go through which meats were not supposed to be eaten, but you can go and read that for yourself in Leviticus 11. There are some things that God said we should not eat. Those are the things that the king was eating, and the king thought he was doing these boys a favor as they were going through their training, that they should eat the same things that he was eating because he thought he was eating the best, but he wasn't. Something else I forgot to mention is that these 4 boys, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, were actually given Babylonian names. Daniel was given the name of Belteshazzar, and Hananiah of Shadrach, and to Mishael of Meshach, and to Azariah of Abednego. So basically, Daniel and his 3 friends requested that it would be given food that would not defile them because they were Jews and they didn't eat certain things. And initially, it was, when they asked Melzar, the prince who had been set by the prince of the eunuchs over Daniel and his friends, when they asked to be given different food, he was afraid, because he said, if I give you different food to what the other boys are eating, I might get my head cut off by the king. But when they pressed him, they just said to him, just test us for 10 days and then see what the results are. And at the end of 10 days, after they were given pulse and water to drink, verse 15 says, at the end of 10 days, their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. The verse 12 actually says, the end of verse 12 says, give us pulse to eat and water to drink. So that's what they were eating. So some Christians, especially Seventh-day Adventists, they'll say, you see here, Daniel was a vegetarian because he refused to eat meat. No, he refused to eat meat that would defile him, the meat that God had said should not be eaten. So just because Daniel said, he and his friends said they wanted to eat pulse and drink water, it doesn't mean that we should only eat pulse and drink water. It's basically because they were going through training, just like soldiers are supposed to be on a special diet, especially those in the special forces, or even athletes. When you're an athlete, you don't just eat anything. You have to be on a special diet. Bodybuilders have to be on a special diet. So Daniel and his 3 friends asked for a special diet, and because they were in training, it doesn't mean that we should also, all of us should be vegetarians or vegans. That's a twisting of scripture, which is done by those who lack understanding. Because later on in Daniel chapter 10, we see that Daniel actually fasted from eating meat. It actually specifically says flesh. So Daniel was fasting from eating flesh. So if he was a vegetarian, why would he be fasting from eating flesh? We need to read our Bibles more thoroughly. Verse 18 says, and now at the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar, and the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king. Now I have to also bear in mind that Daniel and his 3 friends were not the only ones who were in training. There were many boys that were selected to take part in the training. That's why after the test of Daniel and his friends being on this special diet, they appeared to be fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. There were other boys there as well who were Jews, but they compromised and ate food, in quotes food, because food is what God has said we should eat, not eating unclean food. These other boys compromised and ate food that defiled them, which it's a lesson to us to say, when we know what is good and what is bad, we should not compromise and do that which is bad, when God has clearly said we shouldn't do it. And he says, and in all matters, this is verse 20, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. And Daniel continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus. So that verse, the verse 21, basically says that Daniel continued to live until the first year of King Cyrus. So at the time when they were taken captive, Nebuchadnezzar was the king, but Daniel lived a very long life till King Cyrus was the king of the Medes and the Persians. Was king. He lived a very long life. I don't know what happened. I don't know how old Daniel was when he died, or how old his friends were when they died. But Daniel lived a long life, and so that's basically Daniel chapter 1. It gets even more interesting as we move on into chapter 2, which I'll deal with on the next video on decoding Daniel.